Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Listen, don't forget, you need to be looking for my upcoming debate, April the 12th, on Myth Vision TV or blog on YouTube, Facebook, etc., hosted by Derek Lambert. And I will be debating Mr. Mark Smith, who, again, describes himself as a former longtime member of the Churches of Christ. He saw the time indicators of the parousia, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection in the New Testament. He had the concept that it has to be an end-of-time, earth-burning event. Well, that clearly did not happen in the first century, therefore he became an atheist. So Mr. Smith refused adamantly to debate a proposition in which he would defend his book entitled Broken Promises. In that book, from one page, or page number one, to the very last page, it is nothing but quotations from scholars who say Jesus was a liar, a failure, etc., etc. Therefore, the Bible is to be rejected. Jesus is not the Son of God. And yet, Mr. Smith was not willing to defend that book in formal debate. Over and over, he told me, I will not debate my book. Really? Instead, the only proposition he would agree to sign is preterism fails. It's a horrible proposition, but since I wanted the debate to take place, I went ahead and agreed to the proposition. Now, that gives him total freedom to discuss anything and everything that he thinks proves that preterism fails. So it's going to be an interesting debate to see what tack Mr. Smith takes. I have suspicions, but the burden of proof is on me now. The burden is on me to be prepared for any direction that he might take. We'll see. All right. This is video number 13 in our review and response to Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism. We have examined Steve's comments concerning the time statements of the Bible. And really, this video, number 13, is just really a continuance of that, and even in Steve's declarations, and I agree with that, but he does make a separate issue of it. He has a separate focus on it. So in chapter 6, beginning on page 91, Steve addresses what he calls audience relevance. Now, I have long been a promoter, advocate, that we must honor audience relevance. Audience relevance has to do with who, what, when, where, why, and how. When we pick up a biblical book and we read to the church of God, which is at Corinth, to the church of God, which is at Thessalonica, from Paul, the apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, etc. It's really, really critical that we honor the rules of hermeneutic, the rules of journalism, and say, okay, Paul the apostle, who lived 2,000 years ago, was writing to a group of living, breathing human beings 2,000 years ago and telling them things and using language that normally in any linguistic, any journalistic, any literary context, you would think would indicate that the things that he's talking about were going to happen in their lifetime. Folks, when we pick up the Bible, we are reading someone else's mail, as my good friend Gene Fadley, who passed away some years ago, used to say. And it's a great way to look at it. Now, does that mean the Bible has no relevance for us today? Absolutely not. But it was written to them, and we glean from it. We glean from it those things which were intended to be eternal, intended to be eternal in application, But there are some certain things that had application to them and their lifetime, which are not applicable to us today. Okay, so Steve focuses in chapter 6 on the Greek word mello. But he begins this chapter by saying, it cannot reasonably be denied that the passages predicting the destruction of Jerusalem often contain time indicators specifically revealing that it would occur in the first generation of the church. On the other hand, when it comes to actual events associated with the second advent of Christ, no unambiguous time indicators can be found. Well, we will challenge that. Nonetheless, even many of the latter prophecies are claimed to contain features that indicate an imminent fulfillment, so that the resurrection, rapture, judgment, etc., we are told, must be included among those things promised to occur in that first generation of believers. If this is so, there remains no scriptural basis for a future blessed hope of the church. Now, Steve seems to be saying here, if all things are fulfilled concerning the eschaton, then we don't have anything at all for us today. Well, that, of course, is specious. Absolutely false. Nonetheless, he then begins a discussion focused on the Greek word mello. And he says, the Greek word mello, some pronounce it melo, that's fine, which has a listen, catch this, which has a primary meaning of about to, occurs frequently in the New Testament when speaking of future things. Since the Greek word, quote, commonly, unquote, means about to, it often indicates that a thing is impending and will happen quite directly. And then he lists on page 92, he says, Paul told Felix, I have hope in God that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. The word mello is used in the expression will be, so that the full preterist reads the statement, there is about to be a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust. Later, we are told that Paul reasoned with Felix about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, which, because of the use of Mello, full preterists would render righteousness, self-control, and judgment that is about to come. These are only two of about 20 such verses put forward as time text by full preterist. Now, he then gives us a list of passages. And he says, I say these passages pose a challenge only because they require an explanation. That is, he's going to give us some verses in which mello is used, and he said they present a challenge to futurists, but he said they only present a challenge because we have to see what they really mean. Number one, there is reference to the age to come or the age about to come. There is a world or a city that are about to come. Hebrews 2:5, 13, 14. The Son of Man will or is about to come, Matthew 16:27. There will or is about to be the resurrection of the dead, Acts 24:15. There is a judgment about to come, Acts 24, verse 25, so that Christ is about to judge the world, including the living and the dead, Acts 17:31. 2 Timothy 4:1, James 2 and 12. There is a glory that will be or is about to be revealed, Romans 8:18 and 1 Peter 5:1. Now, he then says, page 92, most of the features we associate with the second coming of Christ were therefore said to be about to occur when Jesus and the apostles preached. Does this not prove that all things accompanied the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70? In what other events near the times of the apostles could those things have happened? Yet there is not the slightest evidence anywhere to support the notion that any such thing or anything remotely comparable to them ever happened. Here we have a classic and prime example of Steve Gregg saying, the judgment, the resurrection, the parousia must occur at the end of time. All of these texts speak of pardon me, the judgment, the parousia, the resurrection, which of course has not happened. Therefore, those events could not have happened. We know they didn't happen because, well, the end of time didn't happen. And then he says, when we look closer at the lexicons, it is true that the first meaning of Mello listed in most lexicons is exactly what full preterists claim, namely, that it commonly contains an element of immediacy or nearness of an event or action. Now, folks, you have to understand and catch the power of the fact that over and over and over, Steve admits that the primary meaning of Mello in the lexicons is about to be on the point of. But then he completely tries to negate that by saying, well, yeah, but the lexicons also give other definitions. Some lexicons say that, well, Mello, even in the infinitive, is periphrastic, is kind of an around-about way of saying this is certain to happen, or this is simply about going to happen. And he quotes me on page 95 from my book, in which I take note of the Blas de Brunner Greek grammar, in which, and by the way, the Blas de Brunner has long been considered a classic, powerful, and good Greek grammar. And the Blas de Brunner Greek grammar says, quote, Meline with the infinitive expresses imminence. That is page 181 of their grammar. And he says, this is worth checking, Steve Gregg does. We have acknowledged the indisputable fact that there is one common meaning of Mello, but not the only meaning. Not one of the authorities cited by Preston, that is, the Analytical Lexicon of the New Testament Greek, actually provides the alternative meaning that we have suggested, allowing that the term can mean intend without implications of imminence. Thus, Preston's own authorities turn on him. No, no, it does not turn on me. I cited the fact that Blas de Brunner says Mello with the infinitive means imminence. It does not turn on me by giving possible other definitions. I have never said, listen to me, I have never said that the Greek word Mello can only mean about to be or indicate imminence. But here's what's really, really strange and revealing. By the way, let me read this again. After quoting my citation, he says, this is worth double checking. We have acknowledged that the indisputable fact that this is one common meaning of Mello, but not the only meaning. Well, once again, remember, I have never said that about to be on the point of, is the only possible meaning. Thus, Steve is implicitly misrepresenting me and other preterists by saying, well, look, Blas de Brunner doesn't say this is the only meaning. I never said it did. And I don't know of other preterists. Actually, I have encountered one or two. I don't agree with them. But again, I've never said that about to be and to be on the point of is the only possible definition of Mello. Listen, folks, context is what determines the meaning. You've heard me say that over and over and over again. But here's the fact. Here's what has happened over and over and over again. In internet discussions on both YouTube, Facebook, etc., I have had people say, look, Preston, you say Mello means about to be on the point of, it indicates imminence. But look at its usage over here. It cannot mean about to be over here. Therefore, it can't mean that over here. Illegitimate totality transfer. What a passage might mean over here does not dictate or determine or demand that it mean the same over here. Once again, illegitimate totality transfer. Context is the king. So we continue. Now, notice what Steve admits. This is incredible. Page 95, bottom of the page. The question is not, are you paying attention here? The question is not what a word with multiple possible meanings can or might mean, but what it actually does mean in a given sentence. Isn't that what I just said? That's my meaning, or that's my argument. There are numerous authorities who disagree with the Preston's assertion that Mello with the infinitive always speaks of immediacy. He cannot quote any passage from Preston where Preston ever says Mello can only indicate imminence. Not there. Okay. Now, then on page 96 and 97, he gives us several lexical references in which they say it can mean. And by the way, do we determine exegesis? Do we practice hermeneutic by saying, well, you know, a possible meaning of the word could be this, so I'm going to take that possible definition and impose it? You see, that gets back to the issue. It's all about hermeneutic, and it's all about saying context is king. It is not about saying, well, you know, I realize that Mello, the primary definition is about to be, but I also know that it has a possible definition of the following. And since if I grant about to be on the point of, in this text, it destroys my eschatology, then I'm going to reject that definition there and say, well, it just means certain to occur. Sorry, folks. That is determining definition by presupposition. That is not the way to do biblical exegesis or hermeneutic. So let me go on. Okay, now, I want to examine Steve's arguments here in light of some facts. He says, well, we know that the judgment and the resurrection of Acts chapter 25, Acts 26, Acts 24, 14 following, we know it was not actually about to be because it didn't happen, and because, he says, there are no explicit time statements in regard to the resurrection. Well, number one, I challenge that. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5, Peter said Christ was ready, from the Greek word hitoimos, to judge the living and the dead. Now, hitoimos has a variation of meanings, okay? It has different meanings. There are nuances to it. Number one, you have hitoimos, which can mean morally prepared. We might even say qualified. Okay, that's fine. Judges who have taken years and years and years and years and years in preparation and study and research and testing and what have you are prepared to judge. Fine. However, hitoimos can and does very, very often, in conjunction with the concept of moral preparedness, have the concept of about to judge. Ready as in standing on the point, or, about to judge. Now, Alfred's Greek Testament, commenting on 1 Peter chapter 1, that also says Christ was ready to be revealed, says, same Greek word, hitoimos, says the Greek reader of this passage would understand that to refer to the imminent judge. Alfred's Greek Testament, in Locke. Okay, so when we come to 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, it says Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. Well, Paul said, The judgment of the living and the dead was about to take place. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who is about to judge, Mello with the infinitive, the living and the dead at his appearing and judgment. Okay, judgment of the living and the dead, Mello. Now remember, Steve Gregg says Mello normally means about to be on the point of. So since that's the primary definition, it would be Steve Gregg's responsibility to prove that the living and the dead was not about to take place. But let's take a look at an incredible text. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus said that all of the blood of all the righteous from righteous Abel. Let me ask you a question. Was Abel dead when Jesus spoke those words? From righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and altar. All of that blood was going to be requited, vindicated, judged in that generation. Jesus said, all of these things will come upon this generation. Where does Steve apply that passage? AD 70. Okay, so we have the judgment of the dead, from Abel onward, and all of these things will come upon this generation. That's the living, wasn't it? And coming upon that generation. We thus have Jesus saying that the living and the dead would occur in that generation. Not only that, Matthew chapter 11, Matthew chapter 12, Jesus said the inhabitants of Tyre and Sidon and Chorazin, of Sodom, would rise up in judgment with this generation, Jesus said. Okay, Sodom was dead, right? Right? Sure. Tyre and Sidon, in their long past history. Now, they were still existing at that time, but Jesus' reference seems to be of the past. But here's the point. Sodom and Gomorrah were dead. Sodom and Gomorrah would rise up in the judgment with that generation. Let me ask you, was Israel judged in that generation? Were the living judged in that generation? Well, even Steve Gregg agrees wholeheartedly they were. Okay, then the dead of Sodom and Gomorrah were going to rise up in that judgment. That's the dead and the living. We thus have perfect agreement that when Peter said Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead, we have Jesus teaching emphatically that the dead were to be judged in that generation along with the living. Thus, hitoimos meant not only morally prepared, not only qualified, but Jesus was literally about to judge the living and the dead. But that's not all. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. Now, there's no break, folks. I'm sorry. Contextually, there is absolutely no break here. Peter continues, the end of all things has drawn near, has arrived. Perfect tense of Ingus. Okay, so after saying that Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead, okay, let me ask you a question. Does the judgment of the living and the dead occur at the, quote, end of all things? Now, Steve Gregg takes that, end of all things, as the end of time. I believe it's posited at the end of the Old Covenant age, at the time of the age that was about to come, in one of the passages that Steve gives us. So here we have Peter saying, unequivocally, the end, the telos, the goal, and the termination of all things has drawn near. The time has come. Now, what is Steve Gregg's response to that? Well, he may possibly have been referring to AD 70. But one thing is for sure, Steve assures us, is if Peter was affirming that the end of time was about to take place, then he was wrong. And here's the frightening thing, in my estimation. Steve Gregg actually posits the possibility that the New Testament writers were wrong in their eschatological expectation. He doesn't affirm it outright. He just lays out the possibility that they could have been wrong. But wait a minute. Watch this. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 7, the end of all things had drawn near. Now verse 17, Peter says, the time. Now this is critical, this is important, and it's fantastic. Peter says the time, and he uses the definite article, the, and for the word time, he uses the Greek word kairos. Kairos is not simple time like chronos. Kairos is the divinely appointed time. And he uses the word the. Definite article, the appointed time, now watch, for the judgment. Definite article, to krino. What does that mean? Well, here's what it means. Daniel Wallace, in his massive Greek grammar, Daniel Wallace is considered one of the greatest Greek grammarians alive in our world today. And Daniel Wallace says that not only is the definite article used more than any other word in the New Testament, but he says the anaphoric article is by far the preponderant use of the definite article. Now, what in the world is an anaphoric article? Anaphoric article, simply put, is like this. A speaker or a writer introduces a subject, okay? He continues to discuss that subject, but in order to bring his audience back to focus on that specific subject, he speaks of that subject, i.e., in this case, judgment, by use of the definite article. In other words, in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, reference to the judgment is a direct reference back to verse 5. The judgment of the living and the dead. So what is Peter saying in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17, verses 5 to 17? He is saying the appointed time, the divinely appointed time. You know, the time of Acts chapter 17. God has appointed a time in which he is about to judge the living and the dead by that man whom he has chosen. Yeah, that judgment, that appointed day judgment. He is about to judge the living and the dead at his appearing in judgment, 2 Timothy chapter 4. So here is Peter affirming that Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. The end of all things had drawn near, and the appointed time for that judgment had arrived. Ladies and gentlemen, how much clearer, how much more emphatic of a time statement could there possibly be? But Steve said, oh, no. We don't have any time statements concerning the resurrection or the end of the age. No, to the contrary of that, we most assuredly do. Now, I'm going to stop right here. My video cut off as I was working on it here, and I don't know how well I don't know how good of an editor I am. So I'm going to have to try to join the two segments together and see what I come up with. I hope it works. I really, really, really hope it works. I hope I don't have to do the whole video again. But in the meantime, okay, take advantage of my March 2023 two-book special. That is 8070, A Shadow of the Real End, ? And The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. Now, if you want a discussion specifically about the resurrection and whether or not the Bible gives some very clear, very emphatic, very explicit time statements in regard to the resurrection, go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and order my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, Fulfilled or Future. If you make mention of the fact, and this is U.S. orders only, if you make mention of the fact that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, I'll refund your shipping, and that will save you $5. Okay, once again, I'm going to cut this short. I hope that I can do an editing job to marry the two sections back together. This section is only like 3 minutes or so long, but it concludes what I had already done. Wish me luck. In the meantime, I'll see you on Monday.